Okay, I think we're going to start with a short film, and I'd like everyone in the audience, if you're interested in asking a question, we have index cards that we can hand out, so look for someone in the aisles, raise your hand if you're interested in putting a question down, and we'll ask it of the panel throughout the course of the discussion. But I guess we're going to start with a film, so whenever you guys are ready.
How many MIT students?
This is MIT.
I feel like I got
Our planet is vast. It's difficult to comprehend the scale. It's difficult, too, to comprehend the scale of humanity and the vast changes we've wrought in a lifetime. Population, production, and consumption have grown exponentially. Roads, railways, airlines, shipping routes, the digital revolution. We've created a globally interconnected society. Evidence is mounting, we've entered the Anthropocene. Humanity is altering Earth's life support system. Carbon dioxide emissions are accelerating. Greenhouse gas levels are unprecedented in human history. The climate system is changing rapidly. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assesses the risks and options for societies. Its latest report states it is extremely likely humans are the dominant cause of warming in the past 60 years. Without deep emissions cuts, it is likely Earth will cross the target of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, the target set by international policy. This could happen as early as 2050. If emissions keep rising at current rates, a 4-degree rise by 2100 is as likely as not. It's very likely heat waves will occur more often and last longer. The Arctic will warm faster than the global average. Sea ice will all but vanish in summer within decades if high emissions continue. It's very likely sea level rise will accelerate. cities and coastal areas are vulnerable. In general, wet regions are set to get wetter, dry regions drier. Monsoons are likely to become longer, their footprint likely to grow, and downpours likely to intensify. The acidity of the ocean has increased 26% since the start of the Industrial Revolution. The full consequences of all these changes on the Earth system are unknown. Humanity's carbon footprint is huge. Societies will need to adapt to climate change. The scale of change depends on decisions made now. Can we remain below 2 degrees? It is possible, but it is up to societies now to decide the future we want. For a likely chance of achieving the 2-degree target, societies can emit another 250 billion tons of carbon. We burn about 10 billion tons of carbon a year. At current rates, we will use this budget in about 25 years.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Bonjour. My name is Fabien Fieschi. I'm the Consulate General of France here in Boston. I want to thank you very much for joining us today. I would like to start also by thanking, of course, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and especially also the MISTI and the MIT France program for hosting us and for making this event possible. I would like also to extend a warm welcome and thank to our panelists. They are terrific and they generously accepted to participate in a series of conferences about climate change. I say a series because Boston is actually a stop on a journey that started in Montreal and then continued on to Ottawa and Chicago. And in all these cities, local experts joined our French panelists to discuss the impact of climate change. And this series is going to continue later this year when we'll be back on the road for additional stops in southern cities of the United States and on the West Coast. All these conferences, which were named FACTS for French-American Climate Talks, and American is for America and Canada, United States of America and Canada. They are organized by the Office for Science and Technology of the French Embassy in Canada and in the United States. And the goal is to contribute to the public engagement efforts in advance of the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which will be hosted by France in December 2015. And it will follow indeed the next conference that is going to happen in Lima, Peru, in December of this year. Of course, these international negotiations gather policymakers and negotiators, but it is also extremely important to give a voice to scientists, economists, experts, and civil society representatives in preparation of this global conference. We know, more so now than ever, that climate change is happening and will affect all of us. And it is crucial to know the scientific facts in order to make the right decisions. For this reason, I am delighted to have some of the world's best climate scientists here today to present and explain those facts. We also need to know what climate change will mean practically for us. How will it affect our economies? And what can we do about it? So the economists who are here today will also answer those questions. And last but not least, we need to act, and this will require the involvement of all sectors of society, the private sector, individual citizens, mayors and government agencies, just to name a few. So in closing, because I think that you want to hear to our panelists today, I would like to mention that prior to the official negotiation conference in December 2015, a large-scale climate science conference will also take place in France in July 2015. There will be also many other upcoming events on the road to Paris 2015, here in the United States, in Northern America, in France, and in other places in the world, all over the world indeed. So we hope to see you in those events. Thank you kindly for your time. And now, without further delay, I will give the floor to Mr. Lawson, who is the director of MISTI. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Chap Lawson. I'm the faculty director for the MIT International Science and Technology Program, affectionately known here on campus as MISTI. And also standing in for Suzanne Berger, who I know many of you know, who is the faculty director for the MISTI France program, MIT France. On behalf of both of those programs, MISTI as a whole and MIT France, I'm so grateful to our friends in the French Consulate, the French Embassy, and others for bringing facts to Boston and allowing us to host. And also to, where's Molly? You should stand up there in the back, who's the program manager for the France program for organizing this. She tells me that we're now competing with Secretary of State Kerry, who's speaking on a similar subject at more or less the same time. That's true. I see we're holding our own, and for those of you who made the right choice to come here, we're very pleased to host you. 2 words on the MIT France program before I turn it over to Tom. The first is just that this is such a pleasure for us because it's essential to what we do, to the mission of the MIT France program, about bringing great minds together from MIT, luminaries from around the world, to talk about the 21st century's greatest challenges. And this climate change is certainly one of them. For those of you who are not familiar with the program, it really has 2 pieces. The first is a seed fund, which has so far in the last dozen years or so, with an endowment from the French government, sponsored 95 joint projects between MIT professors and their colleagues in France, and distributed about $1 million in research collaborations, mainly in the form of these small seed grants. The other thing the France program does is sends MIT students abroad, again, to work with French counterparts in research labs and companies. We've sent 760 people from MIT to France over the last 12 years. And the hope here is that we're not only helping to fund collaborative research today, but training the next generation of great scientists and engineers who can be globally competent and serve as interlocutors between the United States and France on important scientific issues. So this is a logical follow-up, and we look forward to many more years of fruitful collaboration with our partners in France at the Consulate, at the Embassy. It now falls to me to introduce our moderator. This is a lot of introductions before you get to the meat of the presentation. I apologize for that, but everybody kind of wants in. When facts comes to town, it's a big deal. Tom Zeller Jr. is a senior editor of Yale E360, Environment 360, which is an award-winning online magazine, provides analysis, opinion, reporting on issues related to climate change and other global environmental challenges. It's based at a university in New Haven that will remain nameless. But most importantly, much more importantly than that, is the fact that last year Tom was here as a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT, where I hope he spent a pleasant and productive year addressing the relationship between public policy, economics, and science as they relate to climate change and environmental conservation. If you Google him, what do you need to know about Tom? If you Google him, he will be described as an American reporter, editor, and writer who has spent nearly 2 decades covering technology, energy policy, and the environment in the United States and abroad for a variety of major publications, including the New York Times, National Geographic Magazine, Huffington Post, and Bloomberg. So first of all, if you do what I did, which is you Google him first and then you meet him, you will be expecting to meet a much older man based on his CV than he actually is. And the second thing I think that this discussion in Google about him is really a long-winded way of saying that he is one of the dwindling number of people in the American media establishment who truly deserve the title journalist. So thank you very much. We're grateful to you and to all the speakers, and I'll turn it over to you.
I'm glad that's all you found on Google. In the interest of kind of getting right into it, I'm not going to waste any more time. It's really my great pleasure to introduce one of the finest panels of minds working on the climate issue that you're ever likely to encounter. So I'll start right here on the end. We have, and forgive me if I botch the pronunciation, my French is not great, but Émilie Alberola, who is an economist and former analyst with the European Emissions Trading Scheme. And she is now in charge of the research unit on carbon and energy markets at France's Public Deposits and Consignments Fund. Her research focuses mainly on the development of carbon pricing around the world and the implementation of Europe's energy and climate goals in coming decades. Next to her, we have the esteemed Jean Jouzel. Jean is a glaciologist and climatologist with the Climate and Energy Lab at France's Alternative Energies and Atomic Energy Commission. He's an authority on major climatic shifts based on his analysis of Antarctic and Greenland ice. He's won numerous awards for his research, including a gold medal from the National Center for Scientific Research, the highest French scientific award. Next to him, we have Susan Solomon. She is an atmospheric chemist. Probably many of you here at MIT know Susan. Widely recognized for her pioneering study of the Antarctic ozone hole. She is the author of several influential papers in the area of climate science. She has been honored again with numerous awards, including the top prize from the French Academy of Sciences in 2008. In 2011, she was named the Ellen Swallow Richards Professor of Atmospheric Chemistry and Climate Science here at MIT. Welcome, Susan. Then we have John Riley. John is an energy, environmental, and agricultural economist focusing on the interactions of human society with the Earth's biophysical systems, including the ocean, atmosphere, and terrestrial vegetation. He's currently the senior lecturer and co-director of the Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change at the Center for Environmental Policy Research at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Then we have Mr. Kerry Emanuel. Kerry is the Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Atmospheric Science here at MIT and co-director of the Institute's Lawrence Center, which is a climate research think tank. His research interests focus on tropical meteorology and climate with a specialty in hurricane physics. And he is the author of dozens of peer-reviewed scientific papers and 2 books, including one of my favorites, which many of you probably have read, What We Know About Climate Change. And then finally, we have Brice Lalonde. Brice is the Special Advisor on Sustainable Development to the UN Global Compact. Prior to this, Mr. Lalonde was the Executive Coordinator for the UN Conference on Sustainable Development and the French Ambassador for Climate Change Negotiations. He also served as France's Environmental Minister from 1988 to 1992, and he is the former chair of the Roundtable for Sustainable Development at the OECD. I'm going to, right now we're going to have everybody kind of make a short presentation, very short, and then we're going to get into an open discussion. Again, if you have questions, we have cards floating around. I don't know exactly where they are right now, but if you're interested, raise your hand. If that doesn't work and you really have a question, we probably could turn on these mics partway through as well. But right now, we talked a little bit about doing things in a certain order, getting our scientists in first, and then our economists and political experts later. So I'm going to put Susan on the spot to kick things off.
Do I have to? No, it isn't. Okay, great. I do have a few images that will help me to communicate some of what I want to talk to you about. I thought I would just take a couple minutes of your time to answer a simple question. People sometimes ask, am I concerned about climate change? And if so, why? What are my biggest concerns? And they really have to do with issues that surround timescale problems in climate change, because I think those are the ones that, to me, are the hardest for people to understand. We have a a relatively easy time getting to grips with environmental problems when we can see them and smell them and taste them, like smog, and when we know that if we stop emitting the offending compounds, the smog will get better. That gives us a sense of reassurance because we know we could probably make a decision about how bad we want to let the smog get and then change our minds at any point. And climate change just isn't like smog. Climate change has a wide variety of timescale issues that really are fundamental to why the risks for humanity are so great. Some of those timescales have to do with the timescales of the planet, of the Earth system, and some of them actually have to do with people. And so I just want to show you quickly a few of the ones that really worry me, the kinds of things that keep me up at night. One of them is just the timescale over which carbon dioxide has increased in the last century or so. And what I'm showing you on the screen here is the last 10,000 years of carbon dioxide's history captured in ice cores in places like Antarctica and Greenland. And you can see that the carbon dioxide was incredibly stable for about 9,900 of those years, and then suddenly, boom, when the Industrial Revolution began, carbon dioxide increased at an unprecedented rate. There's no doubt that the reason for that is human activity, the primary reason being fossil fuel burning. So what this has done is to change the planetary energy balance. It's changed the amount of heat that the atmosphere is holding in, if you want to think of it that way. It also acidified the oceans significantly, as was mentioned in the video, and it's happened so very fast. And yet, even if we stopped emitting carbon dioxide tomorrow, the carbon dioxide that we've put in wouldn't go away tomorrow. So a little bit of it would, but much more of it would take hundreds and even thousands of years to go away. So what that means is that our imprint on the planet is going to last very much longer than the time scale on which we make changes. So it means we need to be far more certain of where we want to take the planetary thermostat in advance before we get there. It's not something we can back out of quickly. If I go to the next slide, I just wanted to show you one of the types of things that could result from that. One of them is changes in the great ice sheets, which again would probably happen very slowly. The great ice sheets in the ocean respond slowly to warming the planet, but the kind of consequences that would have for a place like Boston here down at the Back Bay in particular, you might think of as being a lot of real estate at very low elevation. If the great ice sheets were to melt, the impacts on sea level and on humanity would be enormous. They won't melt completely and they won't melt quickly, but we do know from the last warm period, which happened about 130,000 years ago, the Arctic was about 2 degrees warmer Celsius than it is today. And Greenland did shrink. We know that because we tried to dig up ice cores in those regions and we don't find them. You know, there was no ice there at that time. And sea level was 3 to 6 meters, not feet, but meters higher than it is now. Changes in Antarctica are also a matter of big concern. But now I want to move on and just quickly talk about people. And I apologize to some of the graduate students who actually last night listened to me talk about some of these same issues. But it's such a deep concern to me that I have to bring it up again. And when you think about how much carbon dioxide we in America consume in tons per person per year, if I could have another click, you'll see where we are in that. We're not number one, but we're not far. We're about 20 tons per person per year, which is considerably more than France, by the way. If you look down the list there, you'll find France, and they're much lower than we are. But the key thing that I really want to dwell on is not us or France. It's actually the countries down at the bottom there. If I have another click, you know, when you see this kind of graph, you usually say, well, those people don't emit very much. But if I have another click, you'll see this graph turned on its head. And what I'm showing you here is the ratio of our U.S. emission to the emission of the various countries on that list there. And you'll see that the one on the top, Chad, has a value of 1,000. So what that means is that we Americans emit 1,000 times more per person per year on average than the average Chadian does. For Ethiopia, it's about 200. For Kenya, it's about 80. You can scroll down the list yourselves and see how very wide the disparities are in carbon consumption worldwide. The 6 billion people that are now in the developing world on average emit something like 5 times less fossil carbon per person than the other 1 billion who live in the developed world. So the real key question is, what about their future? If I could have a couple clicks, you'll see, I think, yep, another one, please. You know, it's just a question of how, another one? Yeah, just another one. I guess I've already said all this. Let me move to the next slide, please. So if you add it up across the whole populations of those countries, you get something that looks like this, and I'm showing you here China, the US, India, and Europe, the total emission by each of those regions. You'll notice that China passed the US around 2007, and you can see what the future portends there. The real fundamental issue is that as the world develops, the emissions of carbon dioxide will increase enormously if those people continue to develop using energy and carbon the same way that we did. So that's really the fundamental challenge. It's an enormous one, and it raises huge issues of equity. It raises issues of timescales of how long we want to wait and how urgently the developing world wants to develop, needs to develop, and what kind of energy they're going to use. And I think it's pretty clear that unless the planet wants to get extremely hot, which is a risk we could choose to take, the alternative is to seek methods of clean energy systems which will really allow a very different planet to occur for all of us. And I guess I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Jean?
Yes, thanks, Suzanne. You are correct. Suzanne is famous for her work on ozone, but she's also famous for her work on climate. I mean, she was my boss in the first report, and it was an excellent IPCC report. This is true. So what I can add? So I have also concern about climate change, and to tell this concern is because sometimes, I mean, people say, okay, 4 degrees C, 2 degrees C is the same, it's not so different at the end of the century. It is not the case at all. I mean, there is a very nice graph in the second, we are in the second volume of the IPCC report showing that when you look at all these impacts that were evoked by Suzanne, acidification, sea level change, I would add extremes, but Kerry will certainly say a few words about extremes. If you look at loss of biodiversity, agricultural, I mean, all the biosphere, health problem, irreversible aspects as permafrost melting and so on. If you look at all these aspects, you see that if you go around or below or above 4 degrees C at the end of the century, all the indicators are in red. It's clear. I mean, it's clear. I mean, all indicators, and the point is also this warming will continue after the end of the century. In this case, it will. It can. We can have a 7 to 8 degrees C at the end of the next century. So this is really a world that we should not accept. And the point is that it's a world on which we are. I mean, it's really. I mean, if we continue to, and this is also. I mean, if we continue to use, in particular, there are not only CO2, but CO2 is for 80% of the increase of greenhouse gases every year. If we go towards, I mean, if we use all our fossil fuel, all our reserve is where we go. On the other hand, if we want to limit global warming to 2 degrees C, and this is really, I mean, this is the objective of negotiation, and you see why when you look at this plot. You see simply that if you succeed to keep the long-term climate change below 2 degrees C, I mean, all these indicators are, I mean, okay, they are not, something happened for ocean acidification, for sea level change. Sea level change, we cannot avoid sea level change, but we have the feeling, looking at this plot, that I mean, all these impacts can be more manageable. We could adapt probably if we are succeed. This is the idea of this 2°C objective. I mean, if we succeed to do so, we will be able to adapt. Not for all, but for a large part of the effects. This is the message of this IPCC report. But another message also of IPCC report, and it's I mean, it was evoked in the movie. I mean, the movie told that in the movie at the end, the last sentence, which is correct, is that if we want to keep below 2°C, we have only to use 250 or 270 gigaton of carbon, and this is, I mean, between 25 or 30 years of this year consumption. But there is another figure that you can see, you can extract, and I will finish here from this IPCC report, is that when you look at the reserves, what we have as a fossil fuel easily accessible is 1,500 gigatons. That means that, simply speaking, if we want to keep below 2°C, we have only to use 20% or so of what we have easily accessible as fossil fuel. And this is a clear figure, and it shows that, I will conclude as obviously Susan, that we should go towards renewable and efficiency, I mean, energy efficiency. Obviously, there are also other greenhouse gases that play for 20%, and we should be careful about agricultural practice and so on. But there is such a clear link between climate and energy that the focus should be on these aspects.
Okay. And now, Terry.
Good afternoon. Very pleased to be here with you. I got interested in climate some years ago, and I want to preface my remarks by saying that it's a very, very interesting system to study. Even if it didn't have consequences, it's very interesting. And as I got deeper into the subject of extreme events and how they might depend on climate, I also became conscious of the role that I'm a citizen and a father. And like many of my colleagues, I wrestle all the time, increasingly, with where one role stops and the other role begins. And I want to illustrate that for you by, because I only have a few minutes, to talk about one particular extreme that worries me and may have consequences that aren't largely economic, because the economic consequences are going to be covered very well by my distinguished colleagues on this panel. And it has to do with the extremes of rainfall, actually. I want to say that it's actually quite easy to understand why rainfall extremes will become more extreme as the climate warms, and that we definitely do not need a supercomputer to tell us that. That's very basic physics. I'd love to be able to spend a few minutes telling you about it. It's a lot of people in this audience could understand that pretty readily. But what that tells us is that as we warm the climate, as we continue to warm the climate, rainfall gets more intense but concentrated into fewer events, which means that in general you have, ironically, an increase in both flooding and in drought. Now, floods and droughts and hydrological extremes in general have all kinds of economic consequences, and I am not qualified to speak about those. And they will be, I'm sure, talked about in the discussion and by my fellow panel members. But I became impressed over the last few years of talking to senior people in the United States military that I've had the privilege to talk to about what it means for political stability around the world and what history teaches us about that. I'm not an historian, I'm not a political scientist, but you don't have to be too closely read in history to understand what this might mean, just by looking at what's happened to past civilizations. And even what's happened more recently in the world. A lot of what's happened, for example, in Northern Africa, so-called Arab Spring, has deep political roots, but was precipitated by a food shortage, which can be traced to a large drought in Russia. These things happen all the time. Even the French Revolution, although, of course, it had deep political roots, my understanding is that the immediate thing that precipitated it was, again, a food shortage, hence let them eat cake, right? that arose from the destruction of a large portion of the wheat crop in France by a pair of hailstorms that moved across the country in the summer before the revolution. And this is not coming from me, this is not my expertise, but uniformly among the military people I talk to, is the potential for armed conflict as a result of climate destabilization. It's very interesting that the US military is all over this problem. This isn't actually advertised very much, but the more I talk to these people, the more worried I get. What they're concerned about is the fact that a lot of civilizations, I mean, we're kind of maxed out on our carrying capacity in the planet or close to it. And it's very finely tuned to the current climate. So people who say, how do you know this is the optimal climate? By definition, it's the optimal climate. It's the climate we're adapted to. Even small changes that disrupt that and cause all kinds of problems like political upheavals, mass migrations, and so forth. So this to me is a potentially very serious and perhaps the most serious consequence of climate change, on top of all the other potentially serious consequences that you have heard of or will hear about. This worries me. The history of the world is a history of war. And I'm old enough to have gone through the Vietnam War era and remember what a horrible thing that was, and that was nothing like the world wars. These are the things I think we should pay attention to. I don't even think they're tail risks anymore. I think they're the inevitable consequence. If we keep doing what we're doing for the next 100 years, this is going to happen. And this is what I wrestle with all the time. If I just, as a scientist, say I'm going to stick to my science, I'm going to tell people about my science, I try very hard to do that, then we leave it to non-scientists to talk to the world. And the newspapers are full of op-eds by retired physicists, by people who really don't understand, former provosts of major technical institutions that actually don't know much about climate science, saying things that are actually wrong, okay? And it's because people like me, say we shouldn't be doing that. That compromises our objectivity. So in the end, we're forced to choose between two evils. Do we step outside our confines of academia and put on our citizen hats, or do we leave it to incompetent people to do that? I leave you with that thought.
Let me throw it to you, John.
Well, thank you. Well, as an economist, I hope Carrie doesn't think I'm one of the incompetent people to speak on. So I want to pick up if there's a slide up there, and I think Susan did a good job introducing some of the issues. And I guess this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek at some level. This is the more recent time scale, the last 20 years or so of emissions, global emissions for the world. And on there, I've identified some of the major climate negotiation milestones as well as the IPCC reports. And if you're a casual statistician, you might say, and make the mistake that correlation is causation, you might say if we just stopped negotiating and reporting, emissions would slow down. Unfortunately, there's a lot of casual statisticians in the climate business that come to all kinds of wrong conclusions that kind of write these op-eds that Carrie are talking about. So I don't want to propose that, but this is the challenge we face. As we all know, we need to have emissions going down. Our negotiations should be slowing their growth and bringing them down. Unfortunately, the growth has been speeding up. I think at the beginning of the 90s, they were growing at 0.5% per year. As we approach 2010, they were growing at over 3% per year. So the more we talk, the worse it gets. If you could pass on to the next slide. So this is some of our estimates of this idea of where we're heading. Click another slide, another thing. Can you click again? It was mentioned earlier, this idea of there's only so much cumulative carbon we can emit before our atmospheric concentrations reach above a level where 2 degrees is likely to be exceeded. And I put that line on this chart. These are two forecasts. The blue is kind of our business as usual.
The red is our guess is what might happen out of COP 2017. You see that that has a little bit of benefit in slowing the reductions, but that would mean that by 2037 we'd exceed this limit, which people think would have a good chance of exceeding 2 degrees. So Susan talked about inertia in the system. There's a lot of inertia in the economic system as well. We have a lot of investment in power plants. We have fleets of vehicles that take some time to turn over. Unfortunately, if 2020 is largely dialed in because negotiators stopped worrying about that. That was the Copenhagen-Cancun agreement. So that's already more or less a data point. What we're talking about doing is bending the curve a little bit more between 2020 and 2030. But really the hopes of doing much more than what I have up there rests on people looking at this and saying that isn't enough. So the challenge is great. We're likely to go beyond that 2 degrees goal with some strong high likelihood, I'm afraid. People, often ask me, and there has been this concern over the years, should we talk about adaptation? Should we adapt or should we mitigate? How much should we do both? At this point, I don't think we'll do too much of either. We certainly aren't going to over-mitigate on the path we're on. So we really need to put the pedal on the floor in both mitigation and preparation for climate change. Interestingly, with the superstorm Sandy that hit New York, maybe partly due to climate problems, maybe other sorts of things, but certainly a signal. New York was beginning to think seriously about how they adapted to storms like that, and were beginning to put things in place. They hadn't gotten very far, and so before the storm hit, before they were actually prepared, the storm hit. A lot of people who've looked at the problem said they did better responding to it than they might have had they not been thinking about this beforehand. But that's a bit of the stage of preparedness we're in. Some cities and countries are starting to think about this a bit, but unfortunately, the efforts to adapt are probably lagging again when some of these events are going to hit us. So I think I'd just stop there and move on to the next panel member.
Bonjour à tous. I'm working at CDC Climat, which is a long-term French public investment, because climate change is also investment issue. So as previously said, getting the world on the 2 degrees emission path mean a very different investment landscape. A scenario of 2 degrees will require a massive investment. We have some estimation from, for instance, from the International Energy Agency. We know that the massive investment will be higher than $50 trillion by 2035. What we know also, based on the last report from the Nicholas Stern, the economist, in his last report, a new economy, a better economy for a better climate, the cost of the decarbonation by 2030. Yes. Yes. It's just because I have a cap of time, so I would like to to see the time. Okay, no. Thank you.
The old-fashioned.
The old-fashioned, yeah. So according to the Nicholas Stern, we know that the cost of the decarbonation will be between 1% to 4% of our GDP until 2035. So the main issue is how we can manage this transition towards a low carbon economy. An emerging and growing approach is the carbon pricing. And 2 weeks ago in New York in the Ban Ki-moon summit, there is a strong support by decision makers to support the carbon pricing approach. If I remember the correct figures, 54 countries, 11 cities, and more than 1,000 of companies have decided to support carbon pricing. Carbon pricing could be emerged from taxes, such as carbon tax, could emerge also through carbon markets, but also by a shadow price. And I think it could be the powerful approach in the next decades. On the carbon markets, on the carbon pricing, there are a lot of experiences yet in the world. We know that 40 countries have ever decided to implement carbon markets, for instance. 15 countries have ever implemented carbon taxes. And according to the World Bank, around 12% of CO2 emission in the world are ever constrained by carbon pricing approaches. In Europe, we have an interesting experience in terms of carbon pricing implementation through experience developed by countries with the carbon taxes. 2 decades ago, northern countries such as Denmark, Sweden, Norway have implemented carbon taxes. And since 2005, we have decided to implement a European common climate policy based on the EU ETS for European emission trading scheme. So now it's covered around 15,000 of installation plants, mainly in the forest sector, but also in industrial sector. We are now currently in the phase 3, and we open discussion on the phase 4 until 2027, I think. What have we learned from this decade of implementation of carbon pricing? I think it's good, interesting, it's useful to share experiences on the road to Paris. And I think we can draw 2 main lessons from the European experience. The first lesson is that without a long-term, credible policy commitment, it's impossible to have a strong policy and economic signal for investors, companies to integrate in their decision and to shift their investment toward low carbon technologies. I would like to take 2 examples in Europe. The first is related with renewable energy. We have a European target, but we have different policy to support the deployment of renewable energy. It's national policy. And what we can observe since now few years, 2 years, is that member states start to change rules. And it's not a clear and stable policy commitment for operators, for investors. And it's very difficult, and it's a problem to support the growing trend of the renewable energy deployments. The second example is relating with carbon pricing. We have a very low price currently in Europe, around 5 euros by ton of CO2. And the main problem is that we don't have a sufficient strong long-term credible commitment. We have a target by 2020, and beyond it's not it's just an indicative target. And definitely, as we have reduced CO2 emission in line with the 2020 target, we have no more incentive to reduce more and to have a higher carbon price. So it's a problem in Europe. The second lesson, maybe I can discuss today with you, is linked with the interaction between policy, climate, and energy policy. In Europe, we have decided in 2008 to coordinate our carbon market with our climate policy, with energy efficiency and renewable energy policies. And this is what we observe since 2008 is that there are some interaction between the CO2 target, the renewable energy target, and the energy efficiency target. And the consequence is that the carbon price is lower than expected because energy efficiency and mainly renewable energy have developed CO2 emission reduction, what is a good news for the climate. But the problem is that it's a higher costly pathway to decarbonize our economy. So maybe to conclude, I would like just to emphasize that the carbon pricing approach is a very powerful approach to send an economic signal to investors, and operators, in order they integrate this new value of CO2 emission in order to drive their investments in the next decades. The main risk, I think, is that without this economic value, we can lock in investments for next decades, and it's a very big problem for the climate change. Thank you.
And finally, Greece.
Do you know what? Here, MIT, in 1970, the first reports on the building up of CO2 in the atmosphere were given by the scientists here to the international community, which was going to meet in Stockholm in 1972. So it all started here. It's very important. So the scientists at that time wanted to bring the science into the political arena for the discussion. So it's an unfinished job. And so the problem is not at all scientific. The problem is purely political. And put your hat of citizen and voters and push. Make no mistakes. We have an international negotiation, which is a big caravan with 20,000 people meeting every year, with a funny animal called negotiator. The negotiator has instructions from its government. Don't back on anything. Okay, so nobody backs. It cannot work. And people here, and lots of politicians in other countries of the world, they say, oh, we're not going to do anything until we have an agreement. It's exactly the contrary. To have an agreement, everybody has to do something. The main actors are not only the governments, of course they are very important, but you must understand that negotiators do everything to prevent politicians to get involved in the negotiations. They invent funny words. Nobody understands what they're talking about. It's incredibly complicated. And even nobody understands what's happening during the negotiations. So the people sort of go and read the summary of the day before, written by some NGOs to understand what they were doing yesterday. I mean, that's the thing that's happening. And negotiators, come usually from the foreign affairs, usually believe they hold the national interest much better than politicians, which are all demagogues and don't understand anything. So it's very important for politicians and to get involved, to understand, to take the negotiations from the negotiators and to decide. That's what happened in Copenhagen, where head of states, contrary to people think it was a failure. No, not at all. Head of states came, they saved the process, they negotiated the whole day and the whole night, all together in an awful little room, uncomfortable with no translators, but they did it. And they got the accord, 2 pages instead of 300 pages, okay? 2 pages, they got the essential. That's what we need. And to make myself understood, it must come from countries, because in these international negotiations, it's the example which is important. If a country can do it, we can do it too. So you must start to do it. This is what's happening in the United States, because the government is stuck, or your Congress is stuck, but lots of things are happening in grassroots, in cities, in mayors, in business. So my job right now is to bring business as much as I can, because business, if you want to change the way you produce and consume, try to do it without business, it's not so easy, okay? So we need business, and business, by the way, is getting more and more involved, because business understands, first it's international, and it understands it cannot thrive if the society is ill. It needs to have a good society, things going well. So business is starting to measure, to disclose, to save energy, to substitute another fuel to another one, to compensate, and to negotiate. It's incredible, but it's true now. We're having negotiations between business. For instance, Walmart and Carrefour are deciding we're not going to sell wood coming from illegal cutting, etc. Aviation, fantastic agreement between airlines. The business started. Let's reduce our emissions. Let's try to compensate. All this is very interesting. It's happening right now. But of course, it's not enough.
because you need involvement of governments. Business needs to have a sort of a certainty, and business is having very simple messages. If you're going to go on to subsidize fossil fuels, well, we won't go renewable. That's very simple, huh? Because we don't want to lose money. We're not here to lose money. So stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Put a price on carbon. Yes, as was said just before, lots of companies have a shadow price on the carbon. For instance, Microsoft has a fee on carbon on each of its location. The fee goes to a fund, and with the fund they invest for renewables or saving energy. Lots of examples like that. So lots of things are right now happening. But you need to have the final political push. This will come from you. Thank you.
Wow. Well, that's a great opportunity to kind of launch into a quick look at the UN negotiation process itself, because Brice, your enthusiasm for what happened in Copenhagen, I think it's sort of unusual in that the song that we usually hear is that Copenhagen was a failure, and that the UN negotiation process is itself has maybe outlived its usefulness. I wonder if you or anyone on the panel can talk about why here we are a year from the 2015 conference in Paris. There's a lot of hope that something significant will emerge from it. There is a feeling out there that's palpable that we've been in this place before and have been disappointed. What's changed? Why should we think that we are in any different position and any more likely to find the kind of agreement that you're talking about? I guess, Brice, you're all right. John, do you have something you want to?
Well, I very strongly agree with Brice in that I think the negotiation, I mean, political scientists look at the negotiation process, and it often is a kind of an agreement to agree what we've done is a good thing. And so if you don't have things happening ahead of it, then countries are not going to come and propose something broad and new that they have no ability to actually implement. So I think that it is the fight is in the trenches ahead of that to get countries to go as far as they can and have things in place. I think that's what we see the Obama administration trying to do in the US, and kind of put a set of policies in place that then they can have something firm that they can go to and agree on and kind of propose at international negotiations with good faith that we would actually do it. We had the Kyoto Protocol where we had the fly-in by Vice President Al Gore to agree to something which had no buy-in from the Senate and collapsed soon after. So without that kind of commitment and bottom-up sort of agreement within countries, it's hard to kind of create a top-down thing that then goes back and really gets implemented. So it is really all of us working in our countries that has to kind of push this and get people off the dime and move things forward. It's kind of a shame that the U.S., the power that we are or thought we were seems to be afraid of kind of taking a bold step forward on this and making and demonstrating how we can do this in an efficient and effective manner. And I think if we could do that and get beyond it, then I think other parts of the world would follow. At this point, other parts of the world are a leader ahead of this, and it maybe is a sign of U.S.'s demise that we can't take on this challenge and actually do something about it.
Brice, I don't know if you had anything to add.
I just want to comment a little on Copenhagen because people don't know what happened. And I had the chance, the privilege of being with the head of state. And, the Copenhagen was a failure, and it was going to become a big failure because it was a very clumsy presidency. And the head of states were invited just to endorse and take a picture with the Queen, okay? When they arrived, nothing was done, it was a failure. So they decided, it's incredible, they decided, let's save it, let's work for the whole night. And nothing was planned. It was a little room, it's incredible. You saw people taking pictures of the head of states. I mean, the security was absolutely nothing. It was terrible. But they decided, they did it. And that's what's interesting, as I said, 2 pages instead of 300 pages. One was, I remember Obama coming with his paper, it was writing in Chinese. I don't know if you read Chinese, but I mean, there we are. And it was, what can China and United States agree on, very important for the negotiation. They agree on measuring, verifying, reporting, MRV, so that we can trust the other. Very important, so they agreed on MRV. And after, it was Brown and Sarkozy and the Bongo and Algeria, 100 billion a year for the poor countries, because you'll never have an agreement if you don't have something for the developing countries. So these were the two legs of the agreement of Copenhagen, and of course 2 degrees Celsius.
2 degrees.
So you had all these elements. It was the essential. Okay, so build on that right now. Okay, this means you're quite right. It's not going to work top down, it's going to work bottom up. Bottom up means each country can do something on energy efficiency, on renewables, on refrigerants, on agriculture. Each country can do that. Do whatever you want, but do it, and MRV. So we're going to build up on that. There you can have an agreement, something very pragmatic. I'm sure we're going to have an agreement, because everybody wants an agreement right now. The problem will be, this agreement, will it be enough to reverse the increase of CO2? Probably not enough. That's why we have to go on working. And I mean, this country here, such an entrepreneur spirit, such a sense of innovation. So I mean, it should be possible. It should be possible. You have so many windmills coming, so many efficiency you can win, so many things which are so incredible and fantastic, and even agriculture and biotechnology. All this is important, and digital economy. I mean, all this is so important. It's coming, but it's not coming fast enough. So we have to push. And as I usually say, because I quote Mr. Yamani from OPEC, I love this quote. He said, "The Stone Age did not end by lack of stones." So it's the same thing for fossil fuels, okay? Keep it in the ground.
Great applause line. You mentioned the 2-degree Celsius benchmark, which has gotten a bit of an airing in the last week with a commentary in Nature arguing that it's either irrelevant or it's an impediment itself. I wonder if one of the scientists could explain to us really quickly the significance of the 2-degree benchmark from a scientific perspective. Why does that number matter? And then maybe we can look at how that plays out politically in negotiations. But I don't know, Susan or Jean or...
Well, I mean, there's lots of different ways to think about it, but certainly one of the key arguments initially had to do with the Greenland ice sheet, the temperature at which we had every reason to believe that Greenland would have the likelihood of becoming unstable, become high, and 2 degrees is roughly that number as of some years ago. Actually, if anything, that number's probably come down now. I think most scientists would say, and I think in the 5th assessment, which I wasn't involved in, and Jean was, so he can correct me, I think it's more like 1.5. So, you have to decide if you feel comfortable with a risk of a major loss of the Greenland ice sheet and the accompanying meters of sea level rise that could mean. But fundamentally, it revolves around risk. So the difficulty is that for many people, 1 degree is probably too much. If you live on Tuvalu, your nation will be slated for extinction well before 2 degrees. It's a question of who's at risk and how much are we as a world willing to accept.
Yes.
Yes.
So contrary to some belief, the 2 degree C does not come from IPCC. It's come from, this is a political decision, which is really nice. But really, there are good arguments in the last IPCC report. I totally agree with Susan about ice sheet melting, and obviously this risk is long term, but also ocean acidification or coral reef. It's real problem. As you know, if you listen to Jim Hansen, it would be better on others to value, and it was also in the discussion of is indeed in the Cancun agreement to Copenhagen as 1.5 degrees C is also a limit that some would like to reach. And don't forget, it's not 1.5 with respect to today, but is we should it with respect to pre-industrial, and we take at least 0.6 degrees C already taken from pre-industrial. So it's but it's, yes, there are very good reason when you look at impacts not to take this risk. It's clear on the all. Say again, if you want to keep the ability to adapt, you have to really to stay below 2 degrees C. This is a clear message for me from the current IPCC report.
You both touched on risk perception, which I think plays a big role in generating the sort of urgency that I think John was referring to and Brice have referred to in terms of pushing negotiators forward. So I kind of want to point this to Carrie. What is the most definitive thing we can say now about the weather extremes that we're seeing and their relationship to clear relationship to anthropogenic climate change? Because that seems to be a major stumbling block for a lot of folks. So what can we say authoritatively about those connections?
The only things that we can really say authoritatively is when we look at the statistics of certain kinds of events, and particularly when we have an a priori expectation. So I work a lot on hurricanes. 3 days ago, we had the second most intense typhoon ever measured in the record books, and a year ago we had the first. This is not something that if that was the only data we had, we would call a trend, but it is fully in line with expectations about what happens to that kind of event. The reason that that's serious, so that's one sphere in which we're seeing trends. It's very hard to say that event was caused. This is something that everyone has to understand, is that societies are adapted to today's extreme events. When Haiyan happened last year, this terrible typhoon in the Philippines, it was advertised in the American press as this is what happens in a poorly developed country. Wrong. That particular country is slammed by Category 5 typhoons practically every year. They're adapted to it. Haiyan was a little bit more than what they're adapted to, and that's what happens. It's almost a threshold phenomenon. So when we look at cumulative damage statistics that insurance companies have that integrate over all kinds of weather disasters, not just one, we begin to really see signals that are worrisome. But it will be a while before we scientists who set a very high bar on what's statistically significant can say, yeah, for sure.
Along those same lines, I don't know, Susan, if you wanted to chime in on that, but I think that, the charts that we've seen and the charts that you shared up here today, they really highlight the role of, or the ability of scientists to kind of participate in this conversation. But there seems to be some kind of disagreement over exactly what that role ought to be in the civic discourse. Are scientists doing enough to kind of make the case? Is there more that could be done? Is that not their place? I wonder what your thoughts are. Oops. I'm putting you on the spot.
Yeah, Carrie touched on that more than I did, but I think probably his views and mine are rather different. I have wrestled with this for many years, and many people disagree with me, but to me, this kind of decision is a really difficult societal decision, and it certainly involves our values as well as scientific information. So there are scientists who look at that fact and they say, well, I should engage at my fullest extent possible and put my opinions out there along with my science. Personally, I have trouble with that because I think that we have such a special, wonderful gift in being scientists. It gives us a podium that is unique. And everyone's got values. My values are no better than anybody else's, and I don't think I can really claim that my values are better even informed by my science because they're so deeply part of me as a human being as well. So I think it's a far, for me, it's very difficult to become more of an activist, if you will, in the problem than what I currently am, which is not to be one. To me, I think I have something special to offer by sticking very, very carefully to the science of what I can say and really trying to make clear when I'm talking about my personal opinion and when I'm talking about my science, and keep my values out of the discussion, because it isn't my values that matter. It's all of our values. The best thing I can do is communicate information in a way that's credible. And I think I'll be more credible if I'm refraining from issues of my values.
You know, you remind me that in the US in particular, science itself has become very politicized. And I don't know if you see that as a function of scientists participating in that conversation or not. But I wonder if, I mean, how do we get past those divides, and how do we depoliticize science in a way that can make it meaningful again? Carrie, I don't know if you have thoughts.
Well, I want to say
that one?
something to clarify. I think
Yeah.
there is first of all, I agree with Susan. I don't think we scientists should put forward our personal values. I'm sorry if anything I said suggested otherwise. I do think we should try to communicate our science, not our values, to the public in ways that we aren't doing now. I mean, in some sense, the IPCC was the most massive effort probably in history of scientists to communicate with the public. And I think it was a wonderful exercise, and clearly, unfortunately, not enough. So when I say we should be writing articles in newspapers and talking to the public, I do mean about our science. I don't mean about our values. I just think we need not to be shy to do that much. I think we probably agree on
I
that
certainly
point.
agree with that.
Yeah. I think, no, I am on the same line, but I mean, indeed, Susan is this marvelous communicator. We should communicate our science. And you know this, we should do so. Okay, so we try to do so, but we should be open also to general public. It's not only, but you do that too. But we should keep we could keep stick at our science on what we know and what we don't know. I am clear, but we should communicate, yes.
You want to jump in, Jen?
So, I mean, from an economic standpoint, I think it's even more
difficult,
challenging at some level, because, you know, the science of economics is one of trying to elucidate people's values and ask, how do those values add together and add up? So it's even more critical for us, I think, to try to kind of remain as objective as we can about that value elucidation and what society is trying to kind of think about the values. Not all of those are subject to easy elucidation as a monetary sort of value. But again, I think it's critical that we retain our role as an objective source of information as we go forward. You know, I appreciate activism is important for many things on many things. And so there's an important role for that. But I feel as a scientist, if from economics, I think our evaluations are sometimes seen as prescriptive, but at least I try to be descriptive about my evaluation, saying, if you're proposing a policy, how will it work? Will it work? Will it be effective? What will it cost? What will it do? Rather than, this is what you should do.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and get the scientists out of the spotlight. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the UN climate meeting that happened in New York recently, because one of the interesting things about that was the rather significant presence of corporate players. There was a lot of discussion of the rise of green bonds. And I wonder, either John or Brice, perhaps, or even Emily, you know, what does this suggest to you about what's happening on the ground below the level of UN negotiations? There seems to be a lot of activity. Is it real? Is it just more greenwash? What are we to make of this? How about you? How about Joan?
Well, I think some of it is real. Some of it is in anticipation. So I think finance is looking forward to the idea that, I mean, we talk to the energy industry or you have the IEA saying, this is going to be $1 trillion of new investment we need, or some trillions of dollars. To the financial companies, that's wonderful. That's what they want to do. So you talk to the financial people, we're ready. There's money sitting on the side. If only that it's eager to invest and things are going to make money. I think the question is there supporting policy to actually make that investment profitable? So I think it's a combination of looking forward to, I was meeting in London just last week with some critical people in the financial community who are trying to get climate funds started in their organizations, who invested early in the thinking emissions trading was going to be a big deal. Many of those people got burned because the stuff just didn't turn out. So I think there is a interest in the financial industry in moving this forward. The question is, it still has to make economic sense, and there has to be, and investors who invest in it have to make money.
That there is a question from the audience that I'll follow that up with. What about the power of the oil or carbon corporations, fossil fuel industry, who are now searching and exploring for more fossil fuels? How much of a force is that, a counter force to all of this?
Well, I mean, of course, we're trying to push forward innovation in some of the alternative energies, but we have incredible momentum in innovation in the fossil fuel industry. The gas fracking sort of thing, which may have some benefits for climate policy at some level, but we've managed to explore ever deeper into the oceans for oil. We are mastering ways to turn coal into liquids or gas. So the incredible unstoppable innovation in the fossil industry is an exact counterpart, is a kind of a additional hurdle of which we have to invest, we have to move even faster in the renewables. And so it is a challenge. I mean, and again, it's kind of, if societal values aren't reflected in markets, these companies just say, well, we're just satisfying consumer demands by producing what they say they want based on what they demand. So, I mean, that is the issue of trying to get, if societal values are about stopping climate change, then it has to be reflected in the markets that people are investing in.
And I suppose you don't get any of that without a carbon price,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that's kind of where it all begins and ends. If along those lines, maybe this is to you, Emily, can you tell us a little bit about what some of the lessons, what lessons have been learned in Europe, the carbon market there? We have some fledgling markets happening here in the States now, California and Quebec. We have Reggie here in the Northeast. But there is this sort of ambient perception that the European market, carbon market has struggled. Some would say it's a failure, superficially so. The price has struggled to get above, as you said, €5 per ton, which is not a meaningful price. Tell us what there is to be learned about carbon markets in general and how they can be effective.
Yeah, it's a good question because it's often said that the ETS doesn't work. The ETS works because the carbon price, even if the level is very low, the carbon price reflects the current level of the equilibrium between supply and demand. The supply is currently defined by 2020, and the demand of allowances depends on several factors such as the economic situation, energy prices, and other energy policies, for instance. So what we observe in Europe is that between 28 and 22, which is the second phase of the ETS, CO2 emission decreased by more than the target. And the result is that we achieved the target fixed by 2020, 8 years before the date of the of the year of the 2020. So the result is that there are no more demand for more abatement because we don't have a long-term credible target beyond 2020. So the first answer is that the UETS works. The low price is just a symptom, is not the problem. And again, I come back to what I said previously. The problem is that we have a need, we have the lack of the long-term policy commitment, definitely. And maybe this is the main lesson that we can share with other governments that want to implement this kind of policy. They need to be involved at the long term.
I'm curious if John, if you see a carbon price on the horizon in the United States at all beyond the regional markets that we already have.
Well, there are people like calls from Washington, D.C. about people who are in the background trying to think about this, hopeful, it's interesting, both former Republican top people in Republican politics as well as Democrats trying to kind of put some coalition together. The Congress is a very, I think those actual people in the Congress who are worried about their election are a different story. So it's a challenge. I mean, I've testified in different states across the U.S. and one of the challenges that Europe's face, I think, is Emily has very well indicated, is that the carbon price there has been somewhat undercut by the renewables and efficiency things, which have done the work instead. And in fact, at some points have reduced carbon emissions, but at a very expensive price. The German solar photovoltaic thing viewed as success by many. I think you've worked with Denny Ellerman. I think he worked with some folks who said the cost per ton of carbon reduced by that was like $500. So we have a carbon price of €5, but that costs 500 euros the way we did it. So if we'd let the carbon price do it, the carbon price may have been 20 euros. And so we would have gotten that same reduction instead of some average of 5 and 500 at 20. Obviously, it would have been much cheaper. So I've been on state legislatures where those who think carbon policy is a waste of time and a cost point to Europe and say, look at how bad the economy is there. They attribute that to the climate policy and say, why would we want to go there? So that's why I think we really need to think about not only climate policy, but efficient climate policy. Because if we don't have efficient climate policy, then we start seeing not very effectiveness. We see these high costs, and it kind of then has a negative feedback. People say, well, why are we doing this? We've achieved very little and it costs a lot, and we don't like our electricity bill. So unless we do this in an efficient way, we kind of sow the seeds of the destruction of the policy because public will react against it. So it is a huge challenge. And, unfortunately, politicians and everyone likes the idea of very concrete things they want. We want to support windmills because I know the windmill developer and my congressional delegate is going to give me a contribution to my campaign. I know that it's going to create a few jobs here, but the climate policy is not about creating jobs. It's about solving the climate problem. The job creation issue is a completely different macroeconomic issue. So, we have to kind of get the problem focused on the right thing, not kind of ancillary things which have nothing to do with solving the climate problem.
But there is is there not an economic and I guess tangentially a jobs argument to be made for advancing climate policy?
The unfortunate sort of thing is, yes, renewables will create jobs, but as people move out of fossil fuel industry, that will destroy jobs. So it's a destruction and a creation. It's a movement. It's a requirement that has to have. The macroeconomic environment is going to affect whether we're at full employment or not these microeconomic policies of where you happen to be working. I think we'd be better off working renewables and being, a mile deep in a coal mine and risking our lives. But it's hard to kind of convince coal miners who that's what they do, that they're going to suddenly find a job in putting up windmills. So that's part of the challenge in society of getting people. I think change is always difficult for people, and so they're comfortable doing what they're doing, and they see this as a risk to what they're doing, and so somehow we have to get people past that.
Is that a failure of leadership? Change is always going to be threatening to people on the ground. Are we lacking the leadership to move things forward in spite of that. Brice,
Yeah.
you're shaking your head, Brice.
Yes, we are lacking leadership. This is what I believe. I think I would say two things. One is when I was preparing Rio Plus 20, I went in certain universities in the United States, and I was quite pleased to see students say, when I'm going to finish my studies, I'm going to be active in my community and in my business, or in my business. But I was surprised that nobody thought of creating a movement, a collective movement. I mean, it happened in the United States. You remember the Vietnam times, or the free speech Berkeley movement? You need to create a movement here in the States. You need to link all the universities. You need to bring all the students together and to change the politics of this country. Come on, it's very important to do so. It's all stuck. Look what's happening in your politics. I should not speak like that because I'm going to lose my diplomatic job. But I mean, that's the truth. That's the truth. Look at talking about oil industry. Look, the fact that you can spend, I don't know how many millions from companies to subsidize political campaigns and all that. This is bizarre. For a European, it's you don't do that because after you're elected, guy is going to be prisoner of the people who have paid for him, etc., etc. So lots of things are political here. Also, you have to find the spirit of finding a better future and proposing it and getting involved. This is what is needed. And second, you have to find back the leadership of the United States, because the United States was the leader for all the global environmental movement in the 70s and until Jimmy Carter. You were the leaders. You invented all of it. All the environment came from here. All the science and climate change all came from the United States. And suddenly you stopped. I don't know why. Find it back. We need a global leader, and we need to invent global politics, because nobody is taking care of the global commons. We don't have that. We have a United Nations, which is a union of sovereign states. Nobody is taking care of the oceans. Nobody is taking care of the atmosphere. So we have to invent planet policies. Why don't you do that? It's fantastic to do that. The citizenship of the planet Earth, something you have to invent now for the 21st century.
It's great applause lines. I want to try and get to some of these questions, and I apologize that I won't be able to get to all of them, but you guys are submitting some really great questions. This one intrigues me a bit. When will you realize that among the specialists we need are, I believe this is psychiatrists and sociologists? The Western way of life will have to change drastically. Susan, you're shaking your head.
No, I totally agree with that. I think that sociologists, economists, communicators, people who study how the internet is changing our society, people who study public opinion, all need to be working together on this problem, along with physical scientists, engineers. I mean, it's an incredible interdisciplinary challenge. I totally agree.
And there are people thinking about that.
I was going to say, is it not happening? Or?
Some of us
Yeah, it's
participate,
starting to
a couple of us participated at the Museum of Science a couple of weeks ago, where they brought in a lot of communications and psychologist specialists to think about how to communicate a science exhibit at a science museum that could communicate with the public. I mean, unfortunately, the conclusion from the people that are looking at this is that climate change is not amenable in the United States to science information, that climate change is a question of belief, along with things like evolution and abortion. And so they've done tests of people testing them on their scientific knowledge and their belief in climate change. And if you take people who are liberal Democrats, as their scientific education increases, they believe more in climate change. If you take Republicans, the more they're scientifically literate, the less they believe in climate change. So their argument is, you're not going to convince them with science. It's a belief sort of thing. We didn't get to what exactly you could do in the face of that, but it's kind of, I think, an interesting question. How do we got to this where climate change and some of these other science are a litmus test for who you are rather than a science question? But
yeah, it's
clearly
a sort of
we need
tribalism in a way.
Yeah.
But don't you think we're going for the wrong, I've always felt we're going for the wrong target audience. That, and sort of Brice touched on this, the only way this is going to change, in my view, and this is my view as a citizen, but also as a scientist, is if young people get mad, okay? that does change things. You know, we didn't go fight World War II because we calculated that it wouldn't be too bad for our economy, right? We fought it out of principle. And that's sort of what's missing here, you know, and we had a panel like this a few years ago, and one of the students said, you know, what can we do? Can we recycle? Can we do this? I said, you can get mad. You should be mad that nothing's being done. And that would change the world, right? That would change the world. And that's what we need to figure out how to do.
To get mad.
To get young people to get mad. It's their problem. They're the ones who are going to suffer.
But we created the problem.
Yes. Yeah, they should be mad at us, Susan. They should be mad at us. They should be mad at us.
Well, that's related to a question that just came in. How effective are grassroots and regional initiatives in shaping national and international policies? So they mentioned 350.org, for instance, that seem to have enormous support, but without perhaps tangible results. Is it your sense that these sorts of movements matter? I mean, it sounds like yes. I mean, of course, they have a role to play.
No, I think they do, and I think I agree with Carrie in that. I mean, I think it just takes that sort of activism. I think it's had trouble catching fire for whatever reason in the United States. 350. There's an annual climate ride where people ride their bicycles from New York to Washington, D.C. We participated in the first one with a lot of young people and a lot of 350.org. There was a rally on Congressional Hill, on Capitol Hill. It just has had, why it doesn't catch fire, I'm not quite sure. I mean, so there are nation efforts, but I guess the question is, where is the fire?
Yeah, and this is particular to the U.S., and there's quite a distinction to be drawn between popular opinion in France on the climate issue, I believe, and popular sentiment here in the U.S. So, given that, how well, actually, here's a question that somebody submitted. How do you expect the United States to engage with climate talks when so few Americans rank climate change as one of their top priorities? I mean, I think there was a Gallup poll just in March that put climate change at the bottom of a list of maybe a dozen concerns among Americans. Given that, given the U.S.'s role in contributing to the problem, what hope is there for Paris 2015 or any other conference?
Now we all will need psychiatrists.
Sorry, that's so bleak. But
Can I turn that into a question?
Yeah.
Which is, I wonder, given these problems, whether perhaps the more productive thing that Paris might focus on is really a technology agreement. Is there any thought to being given to that? Is that something that could happen? So what I mean is an agreement to share technologies and to advance a global research and development agenda.
So set aside emissions targets, set aside and just focus on.
Well, maybe not set. We're not going to set them aside.
Deprioritize. Yes. Okay.
But in addition to that objective, I think when I think about practically what's needed. The technology development to make all of these things cheaper and more available, particularly for developing countries down the line. So to make sure that those things are not done in a mode that uniquely benefits corporations who keep all the patents to themselves and maximize their profits. Again, maybe something broader in technology agreement would actually be a very helpful addition to Paris.
I mean, the problem is that the patents are owned by private companies, and so there's nothing governments have to share.
Well, I mean, it depends also on where certain types of innovation come from. Not all innovation comes from private companies.
Most of it is patented in the United States.
Well, yeah.
Breeze, did you want to chime in on that?
No, I think yes, we can build on that. There is already some agreements in the climate talks on technology and technology centers, but it's very sort of cumbersome. United Nations transformed, I would say. What one must understand. First of all, don't wait for the negotiations to save the world. Don't expect act before, because it's only if you act before that negotiations are going to succeed, because negotiations feed themselves on what's happening on the ground, on examples, and show that you can do it. That's very important to understand. So don't always say, oh, let's hope something is going to happen in Paris. Of course, it's going to happen. I think it's going to happen in any case, because people want an agreement. Because if there's no agreement, people are going to say, United Nations, no, stop, it's not working. Let's do something else. So United Nations people, they understand it's very important for them also to go on and to get somewhere. But what you must understand is, as it is in the United Nations is dominated by a group of 77, which is the developing countries. And the experience we have for the last 50 years, each time we talk about the global environment, we have to talk also about development. We're not allowed to talk about global environment if we don't talk also about development. That's the basic fact. And if you solve that problem in one way or another, you get the agreement. But this is something that's very important. And it's very important to understand that the whole geopolitics is completely changing now. If you build a majority with the small countries, they want an agreement and they want it to be binding. Of course, it's never going to be binding, but they want it because the law protects the weak. The little islands are threatened. When I saw, in the negotiations, little island speaking to China, they are member of the same group. You want to kill us? You're gonna drown us. So China, it's a strong, very strong statement. So the whole thing is breaking. All the alliances are breaking. Africa now speaks for itself. Islands speak for themselves. And so if you are a good leader and a good politician, because that's what we are lacking, we don't have the leader. This leader would be able to build an alliance and to get to an agreement. It's political skill, but it's a political skill in the new world. The new world has started now. It's completely different from the 20th century. This is something you must understand.
Shifting gears, I think it would be remiss to have this conversation without talking a little bit about a couple different technologies, including nuclear power and perhaps the export of fracking technology. Carrie, you signed a letter, I think last year, maybe it was, calling on governments to reconsider nuclear power. And can you talk a little bit about the importance or the role of nuclear power in can we do what we need to do in terms of addressing climate without it, or without developing nuclear power?
There is a consortium at MIT of nuclear engineers and others who are knowledgeable about nuclear power and interested in it, and also around the country. And I try to participate in that. Obviously, I'm not a nuclear physicist, but there's no doubt in my mind and in anyone's mind that there is no larger gap between what present technology can do for us in that realm and what the public thinks it can do for us. It's a huge gap. We are, dependent around the world, including in France, on to some extent on nuclear power that's, a generation from the 1960s. And when there's far better ways of doing it that were on the drawing board in the 1960s, and more recently, and never implemented. So having read a great deal about this and talked to people who are knowledgeable, I have to say that this is something that we really ought to be pursuing as part of our energy solution now. There are ways to do it. There are ways you can do it which will also help take care of a really pressing problem that has nothing to do with climate now, which is big stockpiles of fairly dangerous nuclear waste. We have to learn how to dispose of that. New generations of nuclear reactors can help us do that as well. So I think we need to open that book again and look at it seriously.
Yes, great. Completely agree.
How do you overcome the risk perceptions that are attached to nuclear power, which seem to be one of the biggest impediments to moving it forward?
With numbers, with science. I mean, the thing that's astounding to me is if you add up, and I've done this and other people have done this, if you just look at the current energy fatality rate per kilowatt hour generated by source, What do you think is number one?
Coal.
It's coal.
Cool.
Way, way, way up there. In the United States, it's 10,000 premature deaths a year, and we think that's fine. And we subsidize it. How crazy is that? Then you go down the list: oil, natural gas, hydro. How does hydro kill people? They're dam failures. Solar, wind, and at the bottom, with Fukushima and Chernobyl included, is nuclear. Okay? It's not to say that there aren't risks. It's that you have to weigh the risks. There is no risk-free energy source. It's amazing. You know, how does solar power kill people? People are installing solar panels on the roofs and they fall off and they die. And yeah, that's not a big number, but it's still bigger than nuclear. I mean, we have to weigh these risks and we have to be rational about it. And that's the job of scientists and engineers, is to make people look at the numbers and say, wait a minute, the perception and the actual risk aren't the same. And that's true in a lot of spheres of risk.
There was also a powerful argument being made not so long ago that that natural gas was an important bridge fuel. You don't hear that term as often anymore, but there still is a large push to deploy this technology. France, I think, has a moratorium or a ban on fracking technology. But is there, I wonder if anyone on the panel has thoughts on what role natural gas transition might play in all of this, or is that all just smoke and mirrors?
It doesn't go.
Well, I think, you know, if we model a broad carbon tax, then we do see natural gas helping as a transition fuel in the power sector, and replacing coal. I think even accounting for methane emissions, it can be an improvement. The trouble is taking that and then saying, what we need to do is develop natural gas, and then that will be a solution. Because that's this kind of, when you do that, well, then you use more gas and other things, which, you know, where you wouldn't necessarily use it, where you might do more efficiency, or then it crowds out development of solar or wind or nuclear. And so as a bridge fuel, it could be a bridge, but without the kind of supporting policy that's going to look ahead and develop other things, it probably is at best a wash, and, you know, maybe retarding the development of other technologies. So I think I think this is one of those cases where, you know, people often do this. Unfortunately, those of us who run economic models to kind of look at a carbon tax will say, well, this is the technological evolution we see happening in our model. And so people will pick pieces out of that and say, well, oh, then we ought to support X. That's not really what those models are meant to do. And we don't even think we know that much what the technology options are. It's just an illustration of, if you put a carbon tax on, here are some different ways to achieve it. So I think we need to go back and look at these efficient mechanisms, and gas may well turn out to be a part of that future. But I think picking it out and pushing one technology almost never results in the effectiveness that you might think.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Bruce.
I must just say sorry because I have to leave at 6.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to say how thrilled I was 1 month ago, because I was in a conference on recycling CO2, which is not CCS but CCU, carbon capture and use. And there was a factory, a mill in Iceland. They have a lot of geothermal, which is renewable source of energy. So they take the CO2 from people who cement industry or steel. They use a lot of hydrogen produced by electricity and water, and they ramp it up, the entropy, I don't know how you say, la pente, and they produce alcohol, methanol, a fuel. And the whole of the conference was very interesting, because first they said you can produce chemicals, plastic with CO2, but it's not, doesn't solve the problem. It's not enough. But if you transform CO2 in a fuel, it's completely different. So it's just to say, you know, if that's local for the time, it's just one example of. But perhaps it's going to spread. Perhaps it's one of the answers of tomorrow. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating, and I came out from that completely revigorated. I thought, Jesus, it's a new technology. Perhaps it's going to work. So, optimism.
Maybe that's a good moment because we do have to wrap up at 6. I'd like to just invite each of the panelists to provide some closing thoughts on the topics we've discussed, and maybe with that notion of optimism as a theme. I mean, what are your thoughts on where we might be, say, 10 years from now, based on what our current trajectory is politically, in terms of accepting the science and so forth? So maybe start with Carrie, and we can work on down the line.
Well, I would simply say that I think it's become obvious to scientists who've worked on this problem that we're incurring a risk to future generations. Like any risk, it has a probability curve. The near end of it is maybe we can live with. The far end of it is existential. That's a pretty unacceptable risk, and we have to all play our roles in trying to do something about this. And I think we've heard here today, and we've heard in other places, possible routes to this. I put a lot of my faith in technological innovation, but certainly wouldn't hurt to stimulate that by doing something like a carbon tax. We have to have the courage to do that. We have fought world wars. We have fought terrible diseases. We can do it, but it really needs a passionate response of the citizenry to get this going. Experts can't drive it. They can just help solve the problems.
Yeah, I guess I follow them very closely. I mean, I think it's hard for me to understand why the U.S. is afraid of this problem with all the technological capabilities we have. This ought to be an exciting challenge to tackle, and it's not that there aren't issues there, but why not take this as a grand challenge for this generation to kind of move it forward? And while we may not achieve the 2-degree target, we may go past that. It's not an either or. It's not succeeding or failing. Everything we do will prevent us from hitting those existential tails that Carrie talked about. So we needn't get depressed about the fact that we might not achieve everything. But if we don't keep going, then we'll achieve even less. If we give up the 2-degree and say we'll go for 3 degrees and we don't achieve that, we get to 4 degrees. So we have to kind of keep our feet to the fire.
Earlier, I think it was Bryce mentioned how the U.S. had been a leader in solving a whole series of environmental challenges in the 1970s, which is something that really resonates with me and that I've thought about a lot. Part of the reason for that leadership certainly was a social movement. We've talked a lot about the changes in the U.S. and the changes in social movements here and in other countries too. But I think social movements tend to work as pendulums. You swing in one direction and then you swing back. So I'm not pessimistic. I mean, I see that the pendulum's already past the worst, if you will, and things are indeed going to get better. I'm very optimistic about the abilities of young students today, and the engagement that you see on this campus and elsewhere in this problem is just fantastic. So, we've handed this generation the mother of all environmental problems. We really have. Climate change is so much more difficult than anything else that humanity has ever faced. But I really do believe that we will come to a good outcome. And I think it will have everything to do with innovation. I'm not as pessimistic about the ability of companies and countries to work together in public-private partnerships, for example, or things that could be explored more deeply. So I think we have to get creative, but I believe we can get there.
Yes, I would like. I would like also. I would like also to keep being optimistic, but we have to see the difficulty. Again, it's in this figure with fossil fuel. So when we talk about fracking, you have not to forget that if you want to keep below 2 degrees C, you have to only use 20% of what you have in your ground. This is it's okay. It can be a short transition, but we have to look to other way of development than fossil fuel. This is the main message, and so it can be renewable, it can be nuclear if you accept it in your country. It can be more energy efficiency. You have to solve energy storage. You have to develop innovation, but the way is not to go. We have really to change of mode of development. This would be my main message, and not to keep a development as we have done over the last 60 years based on fossil fuels. This is the main message.
Yeah, I totally agree with the previous statement. And because it's the only few seconds, I would like just to add 2 words, yes, we can, and yes to French-American climate talks.
Let's give a hand to the whole panel, and thanks everyone for listening.
It was easy.
It was not so bad, yeah. It's good. Where is the reception?
On the left, I think. I don't know.
Just folks, there's a reception being held
Outside.
just outside here if any of you want to chat and have a cocktail.